Well, I think we are very fortunate today to have one of the younger humanists. Unfortunately, we don't see a lot of them around, but we hope to change that. This is all written on the white sheet, the program. It also has our mission, values, and whatever at the top, in case you didn't catch that when Martin went through it. It starts out, when Dan Pemberton began his work with secular student groups, he expected to see a battle for science literacy with clean lines of science advocates versus religious fundamentalists. He quickly learned that there were far more powerful forces at work that subvert education and devalue science. What more, he learned that the reasons for the rejection of science are largely unknown by advocates of scientific literacy. In fact, I would say most of us don't even realize there is such a thing. Dan Pemberton is the Secular Student Alliance Southwest Regional Campus organizer, gives the URL there. He was president of the Secular Student Alliance at Sacramento State University and loves all things technology, grilled cheese, Legos, postcasts, and hammocks. In other words, he's a young fellow. Dan's passion is for everyone to become a better critical thinker, no matter their religion. And I think that all of us believe on that, regardless of how deeply humanist we are. So Dan, will you give it to us?
Well, as you heard in the introduction, I am Dan Pemberton, and I love my job. I am a professional atheist, as many people like to call it. I work for the National Secular Student Alliance organization based in Columbus, Ohio. I grew up in California, and as I became more active in my campus's Secular Student Alliance group, I soon became president. I became a network coordinator, helping other groups work together and other groups flourish. And then I became a funded activist a few years ago, and I have been loving living on the road ever since, and doing this all over the Southwest region. And what that means is I do that for groups in California, Nevada, and Arizona. I'm soon going to be absorbing New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado, just one step closer to world domination. And I also do a lot of work with groups in Oregon and Idaho. And one of the things that I kind of expected when I started doing this was I was going to bring in the big guns and go on to conquer the awful creationists trying to bring intelligent design into public school curriculum. And whenever we were able to tackle that on all fronts, we were going to win the war on science and science literacy, and be able to create more STEM majors going into college, and be able to declare victory after a few years. And it became very clear that even in a place like California, the other factors that were completely different than religious fundamentalism completely outnumbered the religious right when it comes to many challenges and roadblocks in science literacy in schools. And one of the things that I'd like to bring up, I have a slide just for this, but one of the things I'd like to ask, while I put that on pause, is ask yourself who are some of your heroes in the secular community? Who are some of the best? I don't worry about it. Who are some of your favorite writers and voices and leaders in the secular community? And if you want to shout them out, go for it.
We named it quick.
What's that?
Krauss. Lawrence Krauss.
Krauss.
Isaac Asimov.
Oh yeah, Asimov.
120.
And I like all those people too. And 10 years ago, if you were to ask any atheist off the street who they were reading, who would they be reading 10 years ago? Hitchens, Dawkins. Add Harris and Dennett to that, you've got the Four Horsemen. And about 10 years ago, that was pretty much the reality. There were atheists who had bestsellers in the bookstore, and you go there and you can get any book by Dawkins or Hitchens there. Nowadays, especially when looking at the under 30 crowd, the under 20 crowd, the names of who people are reading are very, very different. And in fact, there are many people under the age of 20 or 21 who have never read Dawkins, but who are very well-read atheists, who are very well-read humanists, who frequent the blogs of people like Greta Christina and Hina Dadaboy and Sikivu Hutchinson and Anthony Pinn. And when I was preparing this talk for the first time, I started asking secular student groups who their heroes were, who are people who are still around, who are still writing and producing new research and new material, and those are the names they gave me. And there is a very different ethos. There's a very different set of themes in their books than that were being written 10 years ago. And it's not because the content is different, it's because the arrangement is different. And the weight on certain pieces of material are different. For example, in The God Delusion, there's plenty in there about criticism of religion and also what the possibilities are in social development and social equality if certain pieces of religion are removed from the domain of public discourse. In a lot of newer books, there's a much heavier emphasis on that. And there's also a much stronger ethos of embracing religious allies, especially on the Christian left. And if you've never heard of the Christian left before, Google it. It is a rising force in politics, and in 20 years, everyone is going to know what the Christian left is. So, and now it's working. And that right there is what I'd like to kind of bring into this conversation early on, and to understand why a lot of younger people who are still trying to fight the battle of science literacy in public schools and in colleges are going to treat it a little differently than someone who might only be familiar with the writers of even as recent as 10 years ago. And so that leads me into what exactly these challenges are. When I talk to incoming freshmen at freshman orientation or even dorm move-in days, and the ones who identify as some form of secular, whether it's atheist, agnostic, skeptic, freethinker, have a very different, I think, set of skill sets that they're bringing into college. Many of them did not learn to read until they were in middle school. A lot of them just don't really know the name of any living scientist, let alone a scientist of their ethnic or gender background. And that is deeply problematic if we want more and more people in a growing proportion of young people to get into some form of a scientific field or job. And these are the challenges that I have at least come to talk about. There were about 800 that I could have put in here, but we have a limited amount of time. And the short list that almost came as a random sampling. I could give 10 of these talks and never hit the same topic twice. In California alone, the stories that I'm hearing from students involve scientists as salesmen, treatment of the scientific and medicinal treatment of their ancestors, local myths, whether these are within rural farming communities or even inner city neighborhoods, seeds planted in their life long ago to reject science and other forms of modern development, reluctance to ask questions, the elitism of science, science is amoral, and what life after high school is really like. And this is, each of these topics I could give an entire talk on. I'm giving 2 slides for each topic. And what's more is that if there was a book written on everything I'm talking about, this would not be that book. This would not even be the introduction to that book. This would be the first 10 pages, the first half of the preface before the introduction. There is a lot to this. The first thing to understand though is that as much as we consider science a process, it's not. And I'm sorry to break it to you. It is a pejorative term. It is a buzzword. And it is a word that is anathema in many communities. everyone wants what they believe, what they do, or what they talk about to be scientifically aligned, to be the product of scientists or the opinion of scientists. A few months ago when Ted Cruz went on Seth Meyer, he said regarding people who claim the world is on fire, debates on this should follow science and should follow data. And many of the alarmists on global warming, they got a problem because the science just doesn't back them up. And it didn't matter what he was selling the rest of the interview. He knew on a gut level that if he wanted anyone to listen to him after that, he had to at least pretend. He had to at least feign regard for science. And this is where a lot of the overall denialism and skepticism of science comes from in a lot of local communities that has nothing to do, at least at the core, of religious fundamentalism. First one are scientists as salesmen. And the shortest way that I could describe this is think about scientists you see on TV. Every infomercial that involves a scientist has a scientist in a white lab coat. I have been to many, many, many lectures on science by scientists. I have seen one and only one who wore a lab coat, and that was specifically to protect himself from blowing up gummy bears with a Bunsen beaker and a graduated cylinder. It was a thick lab coat for protection. Again, scientists on TV, but even this goes beyond just infomercials. In order to sell her as a doctor on Star Trek, they had to put her in a lab coat. Futurama, in case anyone's just tuning in and doesn't know that guy's a scientist, you know he is in a second as soon as you see the lab coat. And this is tremendously powerful. This is a very, very huge piece of imagery that can, on a subconscious level, tell somebody that the person speaking has authority. And one of the other people that was on the list of heroes of young secularists is a guy named David Tamayo. He's a really incredible leader in his group on the East Coast. And one of the things he does is every time he gives a talk to a group that has never seen him before, he waits outside before the talk. And right as someone's about to introduce him, he walks in wearing a lab coat, and he's about to walk up to the podium, and he acts as though he forgot something, and he leaves. And someone asks the audience, what do you think that guy does? Every single time, more than half the people say some type of scientist or doctor. He walks back in without the lab coat and opens with that, about what people's impressions were of him and what he could have gotten away with if he kept the lab coat on and wasn't there to tell people what goes on behind the curtain. This is from a student in Chico. She said in one of the interviews I conducted there, a scientist wears a white coat and takes a check. And this is from someone who, in her community outside of Esparto in Northern California, about every 6 months, every year, at certain times of the season, the community gets about 3 or 4 competing people pretending to be scientists who are going to sell them some type of snake oil, whether it's treatment for their farm, fake anti-seizure meds, phony Viagra, you name it. And it's to the point where even when there are local clinics, most locals do not frequent them. And that's one of the reasons that it's very difficult to get funded, whether it's Kaiser clinics or whoever else you have. It's very difficult to keep them in business out in communities like that because you don't have many customers. And this is one of the biggest ones that was definitely around in the background in a lot of the interviews, and that was tests on their grandparents. And this is a piece of Western history that gets touched upon in almost a novelty, but is rarely repeated. And every time I try to give this talk, or every time I do give this talk, there's always a reason for me not to include the scary details. One time I was giving this over a dinner presentation, and I took out the slides in case there were young people here, kids, so I don't think I'm ever going to leave them in. The short version is that over the last 200 years or what have you, there have been many, many specific situations in which Western medicine, doctors and scientists have conducted human experiments without consent on people, mostly ethnic minorities, mostly Hispanic and African American men. And then during the mid-20th century, a lot of the tests also happened in Southeast Asia during the Korean and Vietnam Wars, and this gave many communities this ingrained distrust of scientists and doctors, that there is always a higher goal. There is always another mission when they are treating someone. A couple of really quick notes. Well, there was supposed to be a slide there. A couple of really quick notes, and just a couple of stories. The Tuskegee experiments, which is sort of the one line in history of human experiments, where many thousands of African American men from the 30s to the late 60s were diagnosed with syphilis, not told the diagnosis, and not given any treatments. And the point was to see how far the treatments would go. There are many stories like that that are consistent, going even further back into the 19th and 18th centuries. Whether it's people who would go in for just very routine treatments, or even just to get a prescription, and to be drugged and knocked out, and then wake up with organs missing. There are more stories that I could ever fit into an hour. And even though a lot of people don't remember those specific stories, the message stays that doctors and scientists specifically cannot and should not be trusted. The next one is that science is amoral. And this was, when I heard somebody say this as a reason to reject science, or as a reason that they were told at a young age to reject science, this was a tougher one for me to swallow. Because it's one of the very first things I say in my talks on the scientific method, on the philosophy of science, is that science does not make the decisions on specifically what should or shouldn't happen. It is specifically a process, it is a method to determine what is happening, how something is happening. Some people say science can tell you how to clone a Tyrannosaurus Rex. Humanities can tell you why this might be a bad idea. Well, so a lot of people would say, great, we need to also fund humanities programs, sociology and anthropology. Well, it goes deeper than that. One student, Jacqueline Morales, said, except the practice of science is not amoral. And that's a really bad thing when you're constantly on the wrong side of social, economic, and political indifference. And that right there, I think, is the quote that kind of gave birth to this talk. And it's the fact that in California, because it is such a large area, because we consider it to be a liberal state, which really just means we have more big cities than smaller states, it's really easy to see past and kind of look beyond the challenges that are happening in farming communities and inner city communities that are many times rather insulated and are still a product of the de facto segregation that we talk about in history books that happened before 1900. That's still happening today. The next one, local myths. And this one was easily the one that I expected the most out of when it came to areas of astrology. People of all educational backgrounds can be found to buy into some level of astrology, especially when they don't know what the difference between astrology and astronomy. However, there's a very set of fascinating studies and research that are coming out just in the last 18 months about people who still express belief in astrology even when they're educated on what the difference between astrology and astronomy is. And there's a study happening right now that is looking to find a control for that, especially within farming communities and inner city neighborhoods. I am eagerly waiting the results on that, but it still might be a year away. Treasure hunting. I didn't see this one coming. And a friend of mine mentioned that she's from the Woodland area and that her aunt was a treasure hunter. And it wasn't just a one-time thing. She was always convinced that there was there was some type of treasure within 15 miles of where she was living at any given time. And my friend tried writing this off as a mental health problem, or that it was just something that maybe her grandfather told her aunt. But then I heard the same story from somebody in the Central Valley, in San Diego, even in an LA neighborhood. And once I started looking for this, I realized that a lot of people have had this experience in their families, but because of different things, especially shame and embarrassment, they really don't talk about it. And once I started bringing this up to groups, a lot of people started talking about stories about their families. And a lot of their families had really, really similar backgrounds. A lot of them were Hispanic Catholics who really did not have a strong educational side or literacy side on what their beliefs or their religion were. A lot of their beliefs were dictated by local myths, but their identity was much older than that. It was the identity of being a Guatemalan or a Honduran or a Mexican Catholic family. And the rain rituals right now, this is one more that 10 to 1, some communities are putting, and some families are putting more money into bringing rain to their farms, rain to their areas than they're putting into any type of good medical care for them or their families. And one of the studies coming out for, oh golly, I wish I had my notes on the screen right now. It was, I don't want to say because I know I'm going to screw it up. I believe it was the American Medical Association, but if that's wrong, please don't grill me in the Q&A. That is looking on exactly that, on how much money a family who does not have coverage will pay out of pocket for this, and the idea is that's going to be compared and ran against recorded numbers for paying into people like rainmakers, and this is something that I'm seeing more and more on, even just within a few miles of Sacramento, reading stories about people who are paying thousands of dollars for just a bifurcated stick, just to shake it at the ground and hoping that that is suddenly going to keep their plants from dying the next day. And lastly, age-old healers. And there was one healer that I heard a lot of stories about that he recently made the news. Did anyone hear about the lawsuit between Adam Miller and Stephanie Goodersman? Stephanie Goodersman works for the Richard Dawkins Foundation of Reason and Science, and she called out a faith healer, Adam Miller, who is someone I had heard quite extensively about from groups. Their families had a bunch of money taken by him, and there was Stephanie called him out on her YouTube channel, and he really didn't take kindly to that, and so he brought a lawsuit for defamation, except he decided to bring the lawsuit in the form of copyright infringement, and he later had to withdraw it because there was no copyright infringement. And if you can go on Google and look that up, it's really quite extraordinary to watch. What's going on here?
Are you open to questions, or you want to hold those to the end?
We're going to open that up in just a few minutes. All right. Okay, well, I think that's going to speed through now. It's all going to catch up. The next one is just the parents that got there first. Every single one of the students I interviewed had very similar stories when it came to the regard for science in their household. And it was very easy for me when I started college to just say, yeah, science is where it's at. Science is ridiculously cool. I grew up with my parents giving me Carl Sagan books. And my dad has a first edition of A Brief History of Time. And that was just something that was commonplace for me. And to talk to people who did not have that was one of the saddest things I thought I'd ever heard. Where somebody did not have the first edition Cosmos on VHS. That it was not considered a virtue to want to know more about the physical world, and it goes a lot farther than that. Contrary to what a lot of public school textbooks will tell us, geocentrism is alive and well today. And there is one study that is often cited that a quarter of all Americans, when asked in a survey, think that the sun goes around the earth. And it isn't just a matter of misunderstanding the wording of a question. It's been also controlled for that. It's also the fact that there are a lot of geocentric societies that are coming up that are specifically preying on a lot of undereducated and illiterate communities. And one of the things that I am realizing with especially a lot of younger people as the secular community grows, more and more people in the secular community are first generation people who have left families, who either specifically tell their children that the sun goes around the earth or have never heard one way or the other. And And what's more, the subject of science is just one of those things you got to tough out through school. And that's something that also doesn't go away even in college. That it's not something that should be studied on your own. It's not something that is really worth pursuing in your own free time. It's just one of those things that you kind of get stuck with, just like a GE class in college that you got to tough out till finals. And one of the last ones about the world of science is also a process of asking questions. And the thing about that is it's also about speaking up, whether it's talking to yourself and learning to whittle down the questions like that, or speaking up in a group, talking to your professor, and forgetting someone's background for a moment. In general, that's just hard. And if you're someone who is not already encouraged to ask questions to people who may not even know the answer, to check your sources, to go to different sources, that's just one more thing weighing a person down in the pursuit of science. And it's even tougher if you come from a family that expects you to never ask questions, but to have all the answers. Others are better at talking. I'm pretty good at talking. Rachel will tell you. And the better you see someone at talking, or when you see someone who's better at talking, it's kind of interesting to watch and not always encouraging to you to ask more questions. And it's already tough enough just to say, I don't know, which a lot of people would say that is the first step of science. And the last one is that when a person hasn't specifically inquired or asked for someone to inform them about something, especially if someone has just said, I don't know the answer to that, or I don't know much about that subject, a lot of people who are very passionate about science want to jump right in and immediately tell them what the thing is, or why they should believe this, or why they should accept this. And I'll give you a different example. There are many, many people, including myself, who are huge Beatles fans. I own all their albums, their first edition vinyls. I grew up with Beatles in my house from day one. And it's really weird for me to hear about someone who doesn't like the Beatles. But what's even weirder is when I watch somebody hear that someone doesn't like the Beatles, they have to fix them. Oh, you just didn't listen to Rubber Soul the right way, or you didn't hear this one song. It's never played right on the radio. And I see that as a great situation that applies to so many different conversations, so many different social interactions, where a person just says, I don't know about that, or I'm just not in that crowd. And people see that as an opportunity to fix that person. And one of the things that does is it keeps that person from being comfortable with saying what they just said, saying, I don't like the Beatles, or I was never told in my house whether the earth goes around the sun or the sun goes around the earth. And every time somebody has that response that they want to fix that person right away, instead of gracefully working in a dialogue with that person and helping that person become acclimated and comfortable to asking questions, the person probably isn't going to ask very many questions in the future. And the last one is the elitism of science, which kind of jumps off of the hard to ask questions. And that's that science is ridiculously cool. It can be boring in the lab. It isn't always sexy. But when it's shown to the public, it's always shown to be really cool. And it's marketed in a way that a lot of people want what science has. Whatever the latest iPhone or whatever NASA is doing, what the pictures the New Horizon took of Pluto. Those pictures of Pluto were not the original pictures. The original pictures of Pluto were several layers of different frequencies of electromagnetic radiation that had to be stacked in a computer and then polished and then released to the public. And that part, that one little snapshot, looks really cool. And the thing is that cool is also intimidating. A lot of people from the earliest ages were sometimes intimidated by the cool kids on the schoolyard. And for many people out of that group, that doesn't go away. And science is just one more way of reinforcing the idea that there is still cooler kids out there in the real life schoolyard, that there are these, that there is this elitist community that is always trying to one-up the people who are not in that community. Whether or not from the inside of the scientific community that's true, but from the outside, for many people, that is the perception. And the other thing about the cool thing, or the other thing about science being really cool, is that science fiction is becoming science fact. A lot of things that were being dreamt up in the books of Isaac Asimov, that were being dreamt up in Star Trek, are now becoming a reality. And that has an entirely different set of intimidating factors. And even as someone who's really into science, who's really into the world of emerging technology, there are a lot of things happening now that seem almost too cool to be science, that are really just this black box of magic that if I was even just a little less informed, a little more illiterate in science, I would probably be very intimidated to ask questions. And lastly, have you seen the internet? Have you seen the comment sections of any website? Go on Reddit, go on science Facebook groups, and watch the response in the comments when somebody says that they have not accepted a specific model or theory in science, and watch how just the snakes come out and just strike at the person who said that. And in relating to the Hispanic farming communities, a lot of schools and communities in urban areas who are predominantly African American, it's almost like science is this elite mystical realm that they need not apply to, because their business is twerking, rapping, and basketball playing. From the very, very brilliant Dr. Hutchinson, and that is something that I had about 5 different quotes from students that were very much in that same vein. That their business was hard labor. Their business was the easier degrees. Business was art, and science were for science people. That whatever they were, they just weren't the science people. And I guess I had one last one, the life after high school. And this one is one of the hardest things for me to sell to a lot of communities when I'm talking, a lot of secular communities when I'm talking to them about this, and that's the school to prison pipeline. And this is one of the biggest factors in more impoverished neighborhoods that devalue education, especially after the 6th grade. And the shortest way that I could describe what the school to prison pipeline is in California, it is this big picture term that allows for police to handle very simple disciplinary actions in schools in lieu of administrators, in lieu of principals. When there is a very simple behavioral problem for a student, instead of being sent to the principal's office like they would in middle class or more affluent communities, the person is sent to the campus police department and bypasses all other administrative lines. And one of the things that does right away is it creates a record for that student in the police database. And that means that every single time a person gets out of line in school, it doesn't get added to their school record or their permanent record, as we called it in my school. It gets added to your police file. And when I think of every time I was sent to the principal's office from about 4th grade on, to think that would be in a police file instead of it just be what my teachers talked to my parents about, I don't think I would be here right now. And that's what the school to prison pipeline does, is that in schools that have that, in middle school and high schools that have that system, 40% of students do not make it past their sophomore year, and 60 to 65% don't graduate, period, as a result of this. And one of the many things that does is that doesn't just keep them from going on to college, doesn't keep them from pursuing their education after high school. It also devalues the education they have now, and it tells the younger generation that's going into those schools that they just aren't going to make it, and there really isn't a point to try. And when I talk to students in colleges in the LA area and even in the Bay Area who have made it out of that, they understand what they have survived. They understand what they have made it through, and they understand what it took to make it through that. And that really tells me a lot about the privilege that I had growing up, was that high school was just something you got through and you showed up to graduation. I should not have graduated, simple as that. I shouldn't have, and they gave me a diploma anyway, and I went on to college like nothing happened. And so finally, instead of just giving you a talk on what's wrong with California, what's all the horrible things, there's really a lot that's good that's happening. And one of the many things that's good about what's happening in California is also the way the secular community has been addressing this, what the Secular Student Alliance is doing about this, and what I'm doing with different groups that are trying to approach this. The first of which is the case model, community advocacy, service, and education. When we're working on events, when we're working on weekly meetings and activities, one of the things that we keep in mind isn't just about having weekly talks that are all about subjects that our incumbent members find interesting. It is also about topics that are going to challenge a person's idea about what service is, about what social justice and activism is, about what the secular community is and where it is. And and many of especially the higher functioning secular student groups, one of our goals is to provide as many services, resources, and enmities to students to a point that when they hear an SSA group is on a campus, they know what that means on a gut level when they're leaving high school. That is going to be the single most valuable asset to them in their college experience. And we have a few groups that have done that very well, and we have many more that are on the way to be at the same place even just a couple years from now. And in review, whether it's 800 or 800,000, the 8 things that are the current challenges to science and even historical education in California: the scientist as salesman, treatment of ancestors, the local myths in the family, what children and young people are told from a very young age, the difficulty and reluctance to ask questions, the elitism of the science community, the amorality of science, and life after high school. And that's what I've got. I'm ready to take questions if anyone has any.
So Sandy here will be keeping a list of people with questions. If you can catch her eye. I saw Mark there already. The gentleman at the front, you were early on. Did you have a question? So we'll start with you.
Hi. I'm not sure whether this is more a question, somewhere between a question and a comment. Some of the topics you bring up, which are very interesting, I think have been around for a long time and are not that terribly new. One example, you were talking about the local myths and the healers. And it reminded me, we live in a world where, I don't know if you've ever been to Lourdes in France or places like that. Mm-hmm. They're very impressive. There are tens of thousands of people who go on a belief which is not based on science, that they will be healed. I think a lot of what we're dealing with here is a deep-grained fear of uncertainty. I loved how you said, I don't know is a good place for science to start. I definitely agree with that statement, but to me, the issues that you're talking about are feeling comfortable with uncertainty, feeling comfortable with difficult things that we can't control in this world, and I think they're issues that have been around since perhaps time immemorial, and that looking at them from a longer-term perspective might be helpful. I don't know if you have any comment on that, but that's my comment.
Everything you said is absolutely correct, and that's one of the reasons I pointed out from the beginning that I was only able to give 2 slides to each of these topics, and one of the things I wanted to focus on was the present-day incarnation of these ideas. And one of the reasons for that is, I've been to a lot of talks where some speakers have congratulated themselves or the scientific community for already winning this victory, that these things are not, the very things you're talking about are no longer a factor for the liberal communities of California. And I think it was Keith Lowell Jensen that said that the South is just whenever you get 40 miles outside of a big city. And the same things that people are doing in France, the same things that people were doing 1,500 years ago, we're still dealing with in communities in the 21st century. Yep.
Hello. One of the things I keep running into in this debate between science and non-science is that science avoids the question of, morality, purpose, the meaning of life and things like that, and has kind of drawn a hard line, sort of ceding that whole world to the religious world. And I think that science is making a mistake in not crossing that line and figuring out, where does right and wrong come from? What is the meaning of meaning? Because when you look at it, why do atheists care what other people don't believe in? There's an answer for that, and there's an answer why science is better than non-science in an objective reality. And I think that we are making a mistake in not going there, that we should figure out, the meaning of meaning in a good scientific context. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Without digressing too far into the various incarnations and the recursive nature of the meaning of meaning, I largely agree with what you say, and I think that one of the things that a lot of STEM programs are trying to do now is make at least make the first semester of the ethics of science a required course. There are more well-funded master's programs in the philosophy of science and science education now, and there is a much harder press for even good outlets for science journalism, and not necessarily pop science or science sensationalism. And one of the things that does is that also helps, I think, keep a lot of the public conduits between the average person and scientists open to the discussion of the ethics and what is happening. As bad as the Jurassic World movie was, I think it's also a good illustration of what goes wrong when the scientists are either indifferent or, even at worst, apathetic to what they're doing and how that's going to affect someone. I think pretty much any Michael Crichton book does a good job at that too. It's, what could possibly go wrong? Oh, lots of things. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Marie Stevens. I just have a comment. First of all, I agree very much with your comments about science, but it isn't only science. I was reading in the New York Times business section last week, they usually, on Sundays, they interview a CEO, and they ask this particular guy, how do you hire for a technological company? One of the things, he has 3 questions he asks. The first question is, multiply 17 by 3. The second question is, when did the French Revolution occur within 200 years? And the third question is, name 3 countries in Africa. And when you think about it, this helps him make the cut for who he wants to hire versus who he doesn't want to hire. That's my comment.
Yes, you've presented many of the problems with explaining and helping science appeal to people. What have you discovered about solutions to these problems?
Yeah, the solutions, that is the talk I am preparing for right now, that I am probably going to be giving maybe a month or 2 months from now at other groups. And the biggest one is don't stop. And that means getting teachers who want their students to become skeptically minded, scientifically minded, that teach according to questions and methods instead of just memorizing details and facts. It also goes as far as also making science accessible to people, meaning when I am at guest lectures at my university, I tend to see events for people who are already people of science, and it's that kind of science person. And I am very, very interested in making making critical thinking and even just scientific exploration accessible and cohesive to people who would otherwise be entirely turned off by it, because it isn't just a class somebody takes. If somebody is not in an academic institution, science still needs to get to them, and that means that also means sponsoring book events where if somebody wants a book, it is paid for and delivered by somebody else. It's about getting. It's also about what the advent of podcasts is doing a brilliant job at. And it's making a lot of wonderful information freely accessible to people. The open courseware movement right now, where you have MIT and 100 other universities that are making all of their classes open and available for anyone to watch online right now. There are 100 other examples, but my biggest, the short answer and the biggest thing I can tell somebody is keep moving that forward. Don't stop. It really, really is working.
Hi, Dana St. George. Can you hear me? I'm kind of wondering how much the prevailing local religious or culture, subculture that a person belongs to is very strong. I grew up in a Lutheran Swedish village in Minnesota. And when my science teacher suggested that I go away to Occidental College to study marine biology, my parents thought that was a terrible idea. Why would I want to go running off to California where they believe God knows what and get into God knows what kind of trouble, okay? And I was much better off going into the local nursing program at the Lutheran Hospital. And so their attitude toward science was that it was a threat to our family cohesiveness and our cultural beliefs, and in fact our whole way of life, and that we're going to come back with a lot of funny ideas, that we're going to upset everyone, and we were going to do something weird. And so it was seen as a kind of a threat.
Yeah, in fact, I have a slide. One of the ones that I missed at the beginning while I was getting this going was exactly that. It was a quote from somebody who, a student in Southern California, who said that that even education after the age of 14 or 15 was seen as a threat to the family tradition and identity, and along the lines of my response to the last question about what to do about this, I'm a big advocate of getting local teachers, scientists, researchers of many different backgrounds to give publicly accessible events. Whether this is a star party, an event at the library, somebody who is going on field trips, whatever it takes to make scientists not just the role models for people who just want to be in tenured programs, but for people who want to be armchair scientists, who just want to build and test stuff in their garages when they're 10 years old. I mean, that's how I really got into science. I'm not any good at the school thing. But I'm good at making stuff blow up in my garage, and that is largely what has shaped my mind as a critical thinker and as a scientist of sorts, and I want to see that everywhere. Yeah.
When you mentioned about rainmakers, the idea of musicals and cinema came to my mind, and it made me think of that famous musical and movie Fiddler on the Roof, and whose title in the new version would be Rainmaker on the Ground, and then that famous song that goes, matchmaker, matchmaker, find me a match. It would be rainmaker, rainmaker, bring us some rain. So I don't know if music might help in helping out with science or not, but because I think music is very important.
I'm very familiar with Fiddler on the Roof. I didn't even make the connection just now, but up until you said that, I definitely agree. I completely agree. And one of the things that I'm talking about in the talk I'm making now is the integration of science, even as a few hundred years ago, and how it's also working now. Science into the performance arts, science into the art of different forms of storytelling. Even if that means syndicated shows like Cosmos and the reincarnated Neil deGrasse Tyson version, or how the one of the offshoots of the Discovery Channel, Discovery Science Channel, in the 90s was where I learned a lot of things in science, and now it is just whatever reality show they're doing. But it's something that really does work in new media and popular media. Absolutely.
I've got a question. So, at one level, when I live on a 4th floor condo, I don't walk off the balcony every morning to get to the shops below because I know I'll die. And most of us don't do that. So at one level, everybody's a scientist at one level, right? We use the evidence of our lives to judge what I don't eat green bananas because I don't like the taste of them. I eat yellow bananas. Other people do the opposite. These are all scientists. Anybody that acts in some way to benefit their own lives by interacting with the real world is a scientist, right, if they do it successfully. Then you get to people that need to use mathematics to actually form some theory that's predictable, that has a scientific consequence. And we probably lose 80% of people at that point, right, because most people don't do maths. And then you can go probably down 10 layers to quantum mechanics, which is operating at levels which are 10 to the 20 beyond what we can measure. But we know those theories enable us to do all sorts of technology we couldn't do otherwise, so we believe them. They appear to practically work. But I know I don't understand it, and I'd need 3 years or 4 years probably of intense study to even begin to understand it. So that's beyond me and probably 99.9% of the population. So the fact is, science to most of us, to any realistic degree, is beyond our knowing. So I guess to a large extent we all believe in science through hearsay or some sort of we need people that at least recognize that process versus denying it because you can't see it. So what's going to make people move in that direction from most of us can't know most of it now and an increasing amount of it. So what you need is people, I guess, that are at least rational and reasonable. How do you train people to be more of that person that at least believes sense and not nonsense?
I ask them to go on the journey with me. And the reason I say that is when I graduated high school, I immediately moved to San Luis Obispo on the Central Coast. I was going to the junior college there. I wanted to go to Cal Poly to do engineering. And while I was down there, I wasn't working. I would sneak into the Cal Poly Career Center to get the day jobs on index cards on the board. And I started getting work fixing computers. I didn't really know that much about computers, but I got work fixing them. And pretty soon with Google, I learned how to do just about anything. But the other thing that I did was that I kept asking questions to the other engineering and computer science students there. And I kept asking them questions until they were no use to me anymore. And then I'd move on to the next person. And I did that for months, for years. And what I decided was that if anyone else ever wanted to learn, I was going to take them on that journey with me. And one of the things that did for a lot of other people that I met along the way was that it got them in a place where they could build first anecdotes. And I know anecdotes are the enemy of a lot of different scientific methods, but that's where a lot of this starts. It's a hunch. And it's about building those anecdotal models, about building the conjecture and finding patterns. And then once we have a pattern that sounds really good, then we find a way to make a control. That one thing that sets it apart from another similar pattern. And I try to spend a little more time in that anecdotal conjecture phase than I think a lot of people, when they're talking about what science does, will give credit to it. And one of the things that I find valuable in that, especially when I'm helping someone else understand an idea, is that they get to have ownership over the pattern they are building, over the model that they are building in their minds. And then when a scientific experiment, when a falsifiable model, when a control is made, then they know what it is that they are testing. And I apply that to just about anything I can get my hands on.
Interesting subject you have raised here, and I don't know if you've heard of this man named John Brockman, but He, in the 80s, started a group called the Reality Club to gather great minds to ask each other questions that they have been asking themselves. Also, to discuss the clash between the humanities and the sciences, which, you know, you would find with post-structuralism being popular in France. Like, there's a guy named Latour challenging scientific realism. And, you know, people like Dene and other working scientists became part of this foundation called EDGE, the EDGE Foundation, and they talked about something called the third culture, where we, you know, have our scientific worldview and we also have our humanities. Anyways, there's this play called Copenhagen, based on the meeting between Werner Heisenberg and Niels Bohr in 1941. I don't know if anyone has seen it, but you know, taking place in the middle of World War II. And for those who'd like to find common ground between these subjects, I'd recommend it.
I am so happy you brought up Copenhagen. I used to, when I was about 10 years ago, I used to talk about that play. Whenever the play would come to my area, I would take my friends to go see it. Michael Frayn, who's the guy who wrote the play, is my favorite playwright. It is brilliant. They are the PBS, I think it was, maybe, did a version of it with Daniel Craig. It's a wonderful play, not only about, you know, teaching someone about quantum science. It is about the discussion of philosophy and humanities within the scientific method, and it is a very good discussion. I saw that, and then right after the pseudoscience documentary, What the Bleep Do We Know, came out, and I took my friends to see that, and we left and went, we want our money back. Copenhagen is a great play and a great film to show your friends if you want to show them a little more about science, the scientific method. Absolutely.
So I want to take you back about 35 years. I was at Stanford in the engineering studies area, and they did a religious study on campus, and they found that in the engineering department, or departments, about 2/3 of people listed themselves as atheist or agnostic. Now that's a very disproportionate number compared to the country as a whole. And I was wondering, do you see deep belief in religion or God as a barrier to people entering science?
It depends on the scientific community. And the thing is that I used to be a very, very devout Christian. I converted when I was 16, and I largely saw it for many years as independent of my love for science. My mentor, who's a few years older than me at the time in college, was a young earth creationist. He was an engineering major at Cal Poly. A lot of engineering students, a lot of STEM students there are theists, even devout religious individuals, and even someone who at the time was a hero of mine. John Polkinghorne, who is a British scientist, a physicist, who I think in '79 he gave up his scientific career and went to go become an Anglican priest. And he is a big voice in that area in bridging the gap between science and religion. The older I get, the less I agree with what he says. I think his new arguments are just phony through and through, but nonetheless, a lot of people don't see that as being a hurdle. However, one of the things I do see in those people are people who have rather been inoculated to some type of argument. For example, I have a lot of friends who grew up in Canada. They're told from the very beginning there is no contradiction between Book of Genesis and modern science in evolution. They're just told from the beginning there is no contradiction. Not why there isn't, just that there isn't. And so the arguments against religion or the arguments against Christianity, especially when they're used by the Book of Genesis, are worthless to them. They don't buy those criticisms and those arguments because they were told from the very beginning there is no contradiction. And one of the things that does is that produces a lot of, I think, very, very fine scientists. However, it also does nothing about stopping the spread of religion into other communities that will sometimes and many times keep people from pursuing science.
I guess we're over here. I'm Bob, and one of the things that caught my attention as a young person was the fact that if you go to a cemetery, you'll find that the young people, or the age of groups in the cemetery that have died as young people, even babies, etc., you'll find a lot of them that come prior to scientific knowledge development, particularly the early part of the last century or the late part of the century before. I was amazed one time when I went to a cemetery and saw all of these very young children and babies dead, which isn't the case anymore. That's a result of science. I was also involved in the development of SSA, which I see you're active with, and I initiated Darwin Science and Humanity. So I've had some experience in this area, but cemeteries really caught my imagination. Thank you.
What do I think about the trip to the cemetery?
Yeah.
Well, I spend a lot of time in cemeteries. It makes me think. Just I use that as a time to contemplate my own life. But a few years ago, I noticed something very similar. Even just a few months ago, I was in Louisiana, and they had a lot of very old cemeteries there. A lot of infants that once you get to 1930, 1940, a lot of young people in those cemeteries just stop. Their tombstones just disappear. And although that I do ascribe largely to the advent of medicine and other scientific developments, but also just in the last 20 years, we're also cremating more, and just bring that up as a type of selection and sampling bias.